Hi, everybody. I'm Carrie Hastings. I coordinate the Urban Water Funders, and I'm here today with Yasmin Zaerpoor. She's the Director of Water Equity and Climate Resilience at PolicyLink, and PolicyLink anchors the Water Equity and Climate Resilience Caucus. So, Yasmin, can you tell us about the caucus and the role that PolicyLink plays, and what is the primary goal of the caucus and what makes it unique?
Of course. Hi, everyone. So the Water Equity and Climate Resilience Caucus, which we shorthand refer to as the WECR Caucus, is a national network that PolicyLink anchors of over 80 frontline and allied organizations that are working at the intersection of water, climate, and justice. Our vision is to live in a world that honors water, promotes generational climate security and water affordability, and builds frontline leadership for systems change. So, PolicyLink, if you're not familiar with us, is a research and action institute that's working to advance a nation that truly governs for all. The economic and racial disparities that we're seeing in who has access to water and the quality of water that they have access to is at its heart a governance failure. So I'll talk a little bit about our federal advocacy work and then sort of more broadly the caucus. In 2024, we launched our Water Affordability for All campaign. According to the EPA's first water affordability needs assessment, between 30 to 48 million people, which is about 1 in 7 households, live in homes that cannot afford their water bills. And without serious intervention from federal and state governments, this number will grow. But I did want to spend a little bit of time before we go into the details of the campaign to talk about what makes the caucus unique from other coalition spaces. So I think first is that our federal policy priorities are built from frontline experience. So our shared priorities are based on lived experience of communities who have either not benefited from or have been actively harmed by federal policy in the past. And every year we organize a DC fly-in during Water Week to help elevate caucus priorities with our frontline partners so that their members of Congress are hearing from them directly alongside the ones that water utilities are presenting as well. And then second, I think what makes the caucus very unique is that while federal policy is a major focus, it's just one of the four strategies that the caucus advances. So the caucus very intentionally works across policy, narrative change, leadership development, and movement building, because the intention is that we're not just building policy wins, but long-term capacity to sustain change. So on a personal note, one of the most powerful things about the caucus is the different ways in which leaders coexist in the same space. So we have members who spiritually ground us in relationship to water that are sitting alongside our policy experts and our legal advocates, and that makes the work so much stronger. And then finally, the caucus has become a really rare, safe space in the water sector for our frontline members. Frontline Indigenous leaders regularly tell us that it's one of the few places where they can show up fully with their lived experience, values, and solutions. And you can see this very clearly at our annual caucus convening and in the delegations that we organize to national water conferences.
So, why don't you tell us a little bit about the scale of the work? You did mention one of the working groups is on federal policy. Is there also local and state work happening? Of course, you have members who are working at that level. Um, but with that, when it comes to your advocacy, tell us a little bit more about kind of the target audience and some of the asks that have come out of that work.
Yeah, of course. So our engagements are nationally. So in practice, this looks like monthly policy work group calls, federal policy work group calls, organizing frontline delegations to major water sector events, hosting our annual water fly-in, as I mentioned, convening regional peer learning spaces, especially in the South and in the West, and then bringing the network together every year for an in-person caucus convening that's grounded in Indigenous and frontline leadership. So most of our policy advocacy as a caucus is at the federal level, but we're constantly learning from what folks are doing at the local and the state levels to see what we can emulate and build up to the federal level. And then it's obviously informed by work that we're doing at the local and state level. So PolicyLink, for example, just wrapped up our 3-year Southern State Revolving Fund analysis and advocacy project. I needed a catchier title for that. But it was a project that we did with 16 community-based organization partners in Tennessee, Texas, Louisiana, and Alabama. And working with them really helped build state capacity, and it also informed our federal priorities that the caucus advances today. And so we see alignment across scales as essential and not just optional. Last year, when we took folks during Water Week, our asks were one, to protect and strengthen the federal investment in water infrastructure through state revolving funds. Two, expanding technical assistance so that underserved, rural and urban communities can actually access federal funds. Three was, we don't really know the scale of the water affordability crisis because we don't have good data on it. So it was to build on the EPA's 2024 water affordability needs assessment by funding a national data collection on water affordability. And then the fourth that the caucus has been pushing for a very long time is establishing a permanent low-income water assistance program so that no household loses water just because they can't afford to pay. So our federal agenda keeps evolving as members continue to do the work that they're doing in their local and state levels. A lot of our members have been increasingly working on flooding and disaster response. And so I think that's going to show up more in our advocacy this year and in following years. And then in terms of targets for our federal work, obviously we're doing a lot of outreach to members of Congress and then staff on some specific committees, which include the Senate Environment and Public Works, House Energy and Commerce, House Transportation and Infrastructure, and then obviously appropriations committees throughout the year. So one of the things that I'm most excited about is that last year we spent the time to really map out who the key target committees were and who the key members of Congress were, and then what relationships our caucus members hold with those, whether they are just represented by those members of Congress or if they've actually actively been building relationships. And so I think our federal advocacy will be a lot more targeted moving forward, and there's still a lot more that we can learn.
So you mentioned in your opening remarks the 80 frontline and allied organizations, and I'm hoping you can talk a little bit more about the makeup, the partners that make up the caucus, and also the structures that you have in place for decision making and priority setting, because that's a lot of groups to
Yeah.
bring together. So tell us a bit more about your decision making and partnerships.
So on federal advocacy, we have now it'll be two, well, I mean, we have two different federal advocacy work groups. And so our frontline partners, along with our national allies, sit in those work groups. We collectively decide on which priorities we want to lift. I think PolicyLink plays a little bit more of a role in sort of bringing those priorities each year um, for our federal advocacy, but then it's with input from all of our partners. But then at a broader level for the sort of administration of the caucus overall, we have really put a lot of effort into standing up a steering committee. So we have a steering committee that has 12 member organizations. More than half of those organizations are frontline organizations, which was really important to sort of the vision and intention behind the caucus when it was originally set up by Kalima Rose from PolicyLink and Colette Pichon-Battle from Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy. So the steering committee sets the overall strategy, the annual goals, governance processes to ensure inclusion, accountability, and results. Things like when we have funding to be able to redistribute to our core members. So we define core members as sort of frontline organizations that are working directly in community, led by people of color, serving low-income communities, communities of color. Um, when we have funding available for them, we have a process where they can apply for movement building grants, for restoration grants, and then it actually goes through um, a process that's administered by the steering committee. So we PolicyLink don't have a say on where that money goes. The steering committee decides where that goes. And So I mentioned obviously we work with members of Congress, federal agencies more so in the last administration than this administration, especially the EPA. We work with other regional coalitions and national water coalitions. So there's a lot of overlap in the Clean Water for All coalition. We've been engaging more with the Healing Our Waters regional coalition in the Great Lakes. And then we've also, in the last few years, been really trying to find where we have alignment with some of the water utility associations. So obviously, U.S. Water Alliance, which isn't a water utility association, but it's sort of, I don't know where they fit, but they have been an active caucus ally member for years now. We've been sort of building alignment and priorities with NACWA and Walla over the last couple of years whenever we go to Water Week, and there's a lot of alignment around the need for a permanent water assistance program and the need for more federal investment in water infrastructure. And then obviously, a large part of the caucus is trying to communicate to the broader public sort of why we need more investment in water infrastructure and why we need to think about water in a very different way, not just its economic value, but sort of our spiritual connection to water. And I think that often gets lost in the policy world.
So, as we wrap, Yasmin, I'm hoping that you can talk a little bit about some of the threats and risks to the success of your work, but also what are some of the most promising opportunities that you see for a group like the caucus?
Yeah. I think there's two main threats that the caucus is facing, beyond the like major existential threats that we're all facing. One is that frontline partners are really stretched thin. So they're responding right now to climate disasters, to cuts to social safety net programs, to immigration enforcement, and then basic survival needs in their communities. And so their capacity to engage in this sort of long-term policy work is shrinking right at the time where we really need it to be growing. And then the second part has been, um, I think funders are very understandably prioritizing local and state fights right now because that's where we're getting a lot of traction and that work is very, very important. But then the flip side is we're also seeing pullback from federal advocacy. And the concern that I have with that, and that a lot of other folks share, is that if we step out of DC, that we lose momentum. And this is right at the time that we need to be building champions and preparing for the next policy window. Like all of the relationships that we're building on the Hill, these are relationships that we need to build. And our champions on the Hill need to be hearing from us even more now than before to sort of keep up the good fight. I think the opportunities that exist despite these challenges. One is that across the political spectrum, I think there's growing recognition that the status quo isn't working, that climate impacts are escalating, households everywhere are struggling to afford basic necessities, which include water. And I think for years, the caucus has been trying to help build public understanding of the growing water affordability crisis. And thanks to our frontline partners like Miss Monica Lewis Patrick from We the People of Detroit, uh, making a distinction between the short-term assistance, which is very necessary, but it's a band-aid, and then true affordability, which will require systems level change. And I think as we're seeing the discourse around affordability grow across the country, this is also an opportunity to bring non-water folks into the water fight. And similarly, for water to see itself as a broader governance issue and not just sort of like a, natural resource management issue. Um, and I think the other opportunity is that uh, we have to rebuild and redesign our legal and regulatory systems to make sure that they work for all people across the US. And it feels especially pressing and timely, and maybe even more possible now as this administration is defunding programs, agencies, dismantling laws, sort of shaking up everything that we understood as sort of the foundation of how we were governing. And so I think the last point that I'll make here is that the system level changes don't happen overnight. So something like Project 2025 didn't happen overnight either. It was built through decades of coordinated investment. And so if we want a real alternative, then funders have to make a similar long-term bet, which is not just on policy wins, which are really important, but also on movement infrastructure, leadership, and the connective tissue that makes durable change possible.
Great. Well, that's a great place to end. Thank you, Yasmin, for your time, for all the work that you and your team at PolicyLink do, and to all the members of the caucus as well for the great work they do in communities.